A coffee mug slipped out of a shaking hand and burst across the kitchen floor. A big man went down with it. His knees hit the tile first, then his shoulder, then the side of his face. He tried to push himself up. His arm buckled. He stayed down there in the broken pieces, breathing hard, one hand pressed flat against his chest. Nobody came. Nobody heard a thing. 2 doors down, a dog started barking at a locked screen door and would not stop barking. That dog belonged to Ruth Ann Pelletier, 61 years old, and she had baked a pie that morning for the man now lying on his own kitchen floor. She had no idea he was dying while her pie went cold on the counter. What made a gruff old biker refuse to open his door for 3 whole days? Just stay with me on this one. Culver Bend, Oregon. If you have never heard of it, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. It sits in a bend of a slow river, and it used to run on a lumber mill that closed years ago. Now half the storefronts on Main Street have paper in the windows. The young people left. The ones who stayed got older. And that is where our story happens. Ruth Ann Pelletier had lived on Sycamore Street for 34 years. She raised 2 kids in that little house, buried a husband from it, and never once thought about leaving. Her husband, Marv, had been gone 6 years now. Heart, same as it would turn out to matter later. After he died, Ruth Ann did the only thing that ever made the quiet bearable. She baked. I mean, she baked like other people breathe. Bread on Mondays, pies on Fridays, cinnamon rolls when the sadness got heavy and she needed her hands busy at 4 in the morning. Half of it she gave away because what does one woman do with 9 loaves of bread? She left them on porches up and down the street. Folks called her the pie lady, and she pretended not to like it, and she liked it very much. Now 2 doors down, a man had moved in the winter before, and he was not from around there. He rode a Harley. A big black thing that rattled the windows when he started it. He wore leather and boots and had a gray beard down to his chest, and arms covered in old tattoos gone soft and blue with age. He was a big man. Military big, thick through the neck and shoulders, the kind of man you'd cross the street to avoid if you didn't know better. His name was Cal Renner, and he was 63 years old, and he had come to Culver Bend to be alone. Here's the thing about Cal. He had not always been alone. He'd come to town with a wife. Her name was Delia, and she was a small, bright woman who waved at everybody, and for a few months that spring you'd see the 2 of them on the porch in the evenings, him in a chair too small for him, her tucked under his arm. Then Delia got sick. It went fast. By late summer, the ambulance came in the night, and it came back a week later, and after that there was no more waving from the porch. Cal stopped coming outside. Not all at once. First he stopped riding the bike. Then he stopped waving back. Then the curtain stayed shut, and the only sign of life was the blue light of a television flickering behind them at night, and a single kitchen window where every evening at 6 you could see him sitting alone at a table, eating out of a can or a box, 1 plate, 1 fork, no one across from him. Ruth Ann saw it because Ruth Ann saw everything on that street, and it bothered her. It bothered her the way a splinter bothers you, a small thing you can't stop touching. A man ought not eat every single meal alone. Nobody ought to. She had a dog. I have to tell you about the dog because the dog is half this story. His name was Domino, an old blue heeler, 14 years old, gray around the muzzle, 1 milky eye. He'd been Marv's dog first. When Marv died, that dog grieved harder than the kids did, wouldn't eat for a week, slept on Marv's boots. So Ruth Ann and Domino, they understood each other. They were 2 creatures who had loved somebody and lost him, and they kept each other going. And Domino, for reasons Ruth Ann could not explain, had taken a powerful interest in the man 2 doors down. On his slow old walks he'd pull toward Cal's porch. He'd sit at the bottom of the steps and stare at that shut front door like he was waiting for it to open. Ruth Ann would tug the leash and say, "Come on, you old fool, that's not our house." And Domino would go, but he'd look back. For weeks Ruth Ann told herself it was none of her business. The man wanted to be left alone. You could see it on him. And she was a widow with her own quiet to manage. But every evening at 6 there was that one lit window and that one man and that one plate. Finally, on a gray Friday in October, Ruth Ann made up her mind. She had a pie cooling on the counter. Apple, the good kind with the lattice top she was known for. And she thought, what's the worst that happens? He says no thank you and shuts the door. She'd survived worse than a shut door. She wrapped the pie in a dish towel because it was still warm, and she went out her front door, and of course Domino came too. She didn't even have him on the leash. He just fell in beside her like he'd been waiting his whole life for this walk, trotting stiff-legged down the sidewalk, straight for Cal's porch like he already lived there. Ruth Ann's heart was going faster than she wanted to admit. She was 61 years old and she felt like a girl walking up to knock on a boy's door. She went up the 3 steps. Domino went up ahead of her and sat down square on the welcome mat, facing the door, waiting. She knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then footsteps, heavy and slow. The door opened maybe a foot, and there he was, filling the whole frame, that big gray beard, those tired eyes. Up close he looked worse than she'd expected. Thinner in the face than a man his size should be, gray under the eyes. He looked at her, and then he looked down and saw the dog sitting on his mat like an old friend, and something moved across his face that he tried to hide. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was rough from not being used. "I made a pie," Ruth Ann said, and held it up like proof. "Apple, I make too many. I live 2 doors down, the yellow house. I'm Ruth Ann." She was talking too fast. "I thought you might like a piece, or a whole one. It's a whole one." Cal looked at the pie. He looked at it a beat too long, and Ruth Ann understood in that beat that nobody had brought this man anything since his wife died. Not a casserole, not a card. He was a stranger in a small town, a scary-looking stranger at that, and the town had let him vanish behind his curtains and nobody had knocked. Except her. Except now. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," she said. "That's rather the point of it." And that got him. The corner of his mouth twitched, up under all that beard, the first crack of a smile. He reached out and took the pie from her, careful, both hands, like it might break, and he was gentle for such a big man. "Delia used to bake," he said. Then he stopped like the name had surprised him coming out. "My wife, she passed." "I know," Ruth Ann said softly. "I'm sorry. I lost my Marv 6 years back, so I do know a little." He nodded slow. Down on the mat, Domino thumped his tail once against the wood. "And who's this?" Cal said, glad, I think, to change the subject. He crouched down, and it took him some effort, and he held out one big scarred hand. Domino leaned right into it, shoved his gray head against Cal's palm like they'd known each other for years. "That's Domino. He's decided he likes you. I apologize in advance. He's got no shame and less sense." "He's all right," Cal said, and rubbed the dog's ears, and for a second the tiredness lifted off him and he was just a man petting a dog on his porch. Had a dog like this out in Nevada, long time ago. He straightened up with a grunt, the pie in one hand. He looked at Ruth Ann, and then he did the thing this whole story is named for. He said, "You know, if I were 20 years younger, I'd marry you." Woman shows up with a pie and a dog. And he laughed, a short, gruff laugh to show it was a joke, and Ruth Ann laughed too quick to show she took it as one. "Well, 20 years is a lot of pie," she said. "You'd best pace yourself." They both laughed at that. But here's the thing. Under the laughing, both of them had gone very still inside, because it wasn't only a joke and they both knew it wasn't, and neither one of them was anywhere near ready to say so. So they laughed. That's what you do at that age. You put a joke over the top of the real thing, so nobody has to be brave. "Enjoy the pie, Cal Renner," she said. "Thank you, Ruth Ann," he said, and he said her name careful like he was setting it somewhere safe. She walked home. She had to call Domino twice before he'd leave that porch. Now that should have been that, a nice thing, a neighborly thing. But it wasn't the end of anything. It was the start. Because the next morning, when Ruth Ann let Domino out into the yard, that old dog went straight down the sidewalk, 2 doors down, and sat on Cal's porch and would not come back. She had to walk down in her robe to fetch him. Cal opened the door sheepish and said the dog had been there an hour. He'd given him some bacon, hope that was all right. And the next day it happened again. And the day after that. Domino had adopted the man, simple as that. Every morning he went to Cal's door. And every morning Ruth Ann had to walk down to collect him. And every morning she and Cal stood on that porch and talked a little longer than the day before. About nothing. About the weather. About the mill, about Marv, about Delia, about the empty town. The dog had built them a bridge, and they were both too proud to build one themselves, so they used his. The empty pie dish came back on the 4th day, washed and dried, left on her porch with a folded paper towel and 3 wildflowers on top. She stood holding it a long time. By the 2nd week, Ruth Ann was baking 2 of everything. And she told herself it was because she made too much. She'd been telling herself that for years. Then one Thursday the porch talk stopped. Domino went down as always and sat on the mat, but the door didn't open. Ruth Ann waited on the sidewalk. She called Cal's name. Nothing. The curtains were shut tight. The bike sat cold in the drive. She figured he'd gone to town, or he was tired, or a man was allowed a day to himself. She collected the dog and went home and didn't think much of it. She should have thought more of it. But it was a quiet gray morning and the pie dish sat clean in her cupboard, and everything felt for the moment like it was going to be all right. The next morning is where it turned. Domino wouldn't wait for his walk. The second Ruth Ann opened the door he shot out, faster than she'd seen that old dog move in years, straight down the sidewalk to Cal's porch. And he started barking, not his usual bark. This was different, sharp and high and steady over and over, throwing himself at the locked screen door, scratching at it, backing up and barking again. Ruth Ann came out onto her own porch in her housecoat. "Domino," she called. "Stop that, you'll wake the whole street." But the dog would not stop. He looked back at her, then back at the door, then barked again. And there was something in it that made the hair stand up on her arms. She'd heard a dog make that sound exactly once before. The night Marv fell in the bathroom. Domino had stood outside that door and made that exact sound. Ruth Ann didn't finish tying her housecoat. She went down her steps and down the sidewalk faster than her knees liked, and she went up onto Cal's porch and she looked in the kitchen window. And there he was, on the floor, face down in a mess of broken dishes, one arm stretched out toward the counter like he'd been reaching for the phone and hadn't made it. He wasn't moving. "Cal," she banged on the glass. "Cal," nothing. She tried the front door, locked. She tried the knob twice, 3 times, threw her shoulder into it, which was foolish. A 61-year-old woman against a solid door. It didn't budge. Domino was going wild now. She ran around the side of the house, her slippers soaked through in the wet grass, to the back door, locked too. But there was a window over the kitchen sink, cracked open 2 inches for air. She grabbed a clay flower pot off the step, dumped the dead plant out of it and smashed it against the glass. It took her 3 tries. Her hands were shaking. The glass gave and she reached through and unlatched it and shoved it up and climbed in over the sink. 61 years old, cutting her arm on the way, landing hard, not caring. She got to him. She got down on the floor in the broken dishes and turned that big man over, and it took everything she had. His face was gray. His lips had gone a bad color, but when she put her cut hand against his neck, she felt it. A pulse, weak and too slow and skipping, but there. He was alive. "You stay with me," she told him, the same words she'd told Marv, the same words that hadn't worked on Marv. You hear me, Cal Renner? You stay right here with me." She found his phone under the table where it had slid, and she called 911, and she told them a man was down, a heart maybe, and she gave the address twice because her voice was shaking. Then she held his big head in her lap on that cold kitchen floor and she talked to him. Just talked. "Anything, don't you go, don't you dare. I've got a whole pie for you at home. You owe me a pie dish. You can't go yet." And through the screen door Domino watched, quiet now, finally quiet, having done the one thing he'd come to do. The ambulance took 11 minutes. Ruth Ann rode with him, holding his hand the whole way, and a young paramedic asked her, "Are you family?" And Ruth Ann, who was 2 doors down and a pie and 11 porch conversations, opened her mouth to say no. And she said, "Yes, yes, I'm family." If you have ever had a neighbor who was more than a neighbor, if you have ever loved somebody you were too old or too scared or too proud to say it to, then you already understand this story, and I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what happens next is the part that changed both their lives. Now, at the hospital, they took Cal back through swinging doors and Ruth Ann was left in a plastic chair, and that is where the second thing hit her, the thing that turned this from a bad morning into something much larger. A nurse came out with a clipboard and sat beside her and said, gently, "Are you the one who found him? Ma'am, did you know he was sick?" Ruth Ann shook her head. The nurse said, "He has a file with us. He came in back in August. Congestive heart failure advanced." The doctors told him then. They wanted to admit him, start treatment, talk about a device, maybe a transplant list. He signed himself out that same day, against advice. He never came back. He never filled a single prescription. Ruth Ann sat very still. "He's known for 2 months, the nurse said, and he chose to do nothing." And that is when Ruth Ann understood why the porch talks had stopped, why the curtain stayed shut, why a man would climb into a hole and pull it shut over himself and eat alone every night out of a can. He wasn't just grieving. He was dying, and he had decided to do it quietly, alone, where nobody would have to watch, where nobody would have to sit by a bed the way he'd sat by Delia's. He hadn't stopped coming outside because he didn't care. He'd stopped because he did. They kept Cal 3 days. The first day he didn't wake up much, and when he did he was confused, and Ruth Ann stayed anyway in the chair, going home only to feed Domino and let him out, and the dog would not eat and lay by the front door pointed at Cal's house the whole time. The second day Cal woke up clear. Ruth Ann was there when he opened his eyes. She watched him figure out where he was. The white ceiling, the beeping, the tubes. She watched the exact moment he understood what had happened, and worse, that somebody had found him, that his plan had failed, that he was still here and people knew. His face closed up like a fist. "You shouldn't have," he said. "Rough and not grateful, you shouldn't have come." "Well, I did," Ruth Ann said. "I had it handled." "You had it handled," she repeated flat. "You were face down in your own broke dishes reaching for a phone you couldn't get to. That's not handled, Cal. That's the opposite of handled." He turned his face to the window. "I didn't ask for this." "No," she said, "you didn't. You decided all by yourself to crawl off and die and not tell a living soul. That's what you decided." Her voice cracked and she let it. "The nurse told me, August. You've known since August." He didn't say anything. "Why?" Ruth Ann said. And when he still didn't answer, she leaned forward and she said it again, harder. "Why, Cal? You look at me and you tell me why." And the big man, the biker, the scary stranger the whole town crossed the street to avoid, put his hand over his eyes like a boy, and his shoulders started to shake. "Because I already did it once," he said. "I sat by Delia for 4 months. I watched every day of it. I held her hand while she stopped being her. And when it was over, I told myself, no, not to anybody else. I'm not going to make somebody sit in that chair and watch me go the way I watched her. I'm not going to do that to a person, so I figured I'd just. He stopped. I'd just do it quiet, on my own, nobody's business. And then a fool dog started showing up on your porch, Ruth Ann said. A wet laugh came out of him. And then a fool dog started showing up on my porch, he said. And a woman with a pie. And God help me, Ruth Ann, I started looking forward to the mornings. Every morning I told myself, don't get attached to something you're about to leave. It's cruel to her. So a week ago I stopped answering the door. I thought if I just stopped, you'd forget about me and it'd be easier on you when I went. That's why. That's the whole ugly why of it. Ruth Ann sat with that a long moment. Then she reached over and pulled his hand down off his face and held it in both of hers, and she made him look at her. Now you listen to me, she said. You don't get to decide that for me, you hear? You don't get to decide, all on your own, to spare me. That's not sparing me. Leaving quiet in the night so I find out from a nurse 2 doors down that would have broke me worse than any chair by any bed. You think Delia's people wish they hadn't sat with her. You think anybody at the end wishes they'd loved somebody less. He couldn't answer. When you said that thing on the porch, Ruth Ann went on, softer now, that if you were 20 years younger you'd marry me, you laughed, I laughed. We both laughed so we wouldn't have to be honest. Well, I'm 61 and I'm too old to keep laughing over the top of the truth. So here it is plain. I don't want 20 years younger. I don't want any other version of you. I want the one right here in this bed with the bad heart and the fool notion he has to die alone. That's the one I want, however long or short it comes. The room was quiet except for the machines. It could be short, Cal said. You understand that could be real short. Then it's short, Ruth Ann said. And I'll have had it. I buried Marv after 34 years, and I'd do all 34 again knowing how it ended. You don't get less time by loving somebody. You just get more life in the time you've got. Cal Renner looked at this small, stubborn woman holding his hand, and whatever wall he'd built in August, whatever door he'd shut, it came down right there. He turned his hand over and held hers back tight, and he cried, and she let him. And she didn't tell him to stop, and outside 2 doors down an old dog lay against a front door waiting for them both to come home. Here's what happened after, because I promised you the truth of it, and the truth is not a fairy tale, but it's better than one in some ways. Cal let them treat him. That was the first thing, and it was the biggest thing because it was him choosing to stay. The doctors got him on the right medicines, the ones he'd thrown out in August. They talked about a little device to help the heart keep its rhythm, and after a while he agreed to that too. It wasn't a cure. Nobody promised him one. A bad heart is a bad heart. But there is a wide country between dying alone on a kitchen floor and living with something, and Cal moved into that country and stayed there. Ruth Ann drove him to every appointment. She learned his pills better than he did, lined them up in a plastic box with the days of the week. She fed him proper food, made him walk a little more each day, first to the end of the porch, then to the mailbox, then by spring, all the way down to her yellow house and back with Domino leading the way like a slow gray parade marshal. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. The scary stranger and the pie lady, walking arm in arm down Sycamore Street of an evening. And the funny thing, the thing about small towns, once they had a reason to stop crossing the street, they did. People started saying hello to Cal. The man at the hardware store knew his name. A couple of the older fellows found out he'd wrenched on bikes his whole life and started bringing their mowers and their old machines by for him to look at. And Cal, who had come to Culver Bend to disappear, became a man the town leaned on. He never did move back behind those curtains. He kept them open now. And every evening at 6 there were 2 plates on that kitchen table and 2 forks and a dog under the table hoping for scraps and usually getting them. They got married in June. In Ruth Ann's backyard, under the apple tree that gave the apples for the pies. It was a small thing. Her kids came. A dozen neighbors came. Cal wore a clean shirt and his one good jacket that pulled tight across his shoulders, and Ruth Ann wore blue, and they stood under that tree, and the pastor from the little church said the words. And when it came to the part, Cal took Ruth Ann's hands, and he was crying before he even started, this big man, and he said, "I told you once if I were 20 years younger I'd marry you." He had to stop and gather himself. Well, I'm not 20 years younger. I'm an old man with a patched-up heart and not near enough time, but I'd rather have my little bit of time with you than 100 years with anybody else. So I'm not waiting to be younger. I'm marrying you now. Today. Just the way I am. And Ruth Ann, who had laughed over the top of the truth on a porch in October, did not laugh this time. She just held on to his hands and let the whole backyard see her cry. Domino was there too. 14 and gray and slow, he sat right at their feet the whole ceremony, front and center, on account of everybody agreed he'd earned it. He was the one who knew. Before either of them would say it, before either of them was brave enough, that old dog had walked down the sidewalk day after day and sat on a dying man's porch and refused to leave, because he understood something the two grown people were too proud and too scared to admit. That nobody's meant to eat alone. That a shut door is a thing to be knocked on. That love doesn't check how much time is left on the clock before it shows up. Cal got 2 more years. I'll be honest with you because I said I would. It wasn't forever. His heart gave out again on a morning the next fall, but this time he wasn't on any floor, and he wasn't reaching for any phone he couldn't get to. He was in his own bed in the house they shared, with Ruth Ann holding one hand and that old dog's head resting on the other, and the curtains open, and the morning coming in. He was not alone. He was the furthest thing from alone a man can be. Ruth Ann buried her second husband from the same little house she'd buried her first. And when people said to her, "Oh, but it was so short, you had so little time," she'd shake her head. She'd say what she said in that hospital room. You don't get less time by loving somebody. You get more life in the time you've got. She still bakes. Pies on Fridays, the good apple with the lattice top. And she still makes 2 of everything out of habit, and she still leaves the extra on porches up and down the street. Because you never know, she'll tell you, which shut door has somebody behind it eating alone. And you never know what a warm pie and a fool old dog might start. Domino's gone now too. He went peaceful in his sleep, on the mat by the front door where he liked to keep watch. Ruth Ann buried him under the apple tree next to a flat stone that just says Cal, and she planted wildflowers over the both of them, the same kind Cal once left on her clean pie dish with a folded paper towel, back when neither one of them could say a single true thing out loud. She sits out on that porch most evenings, and if you walked by she'd wave. And if you looked lonely she'd offer you a slice. That's all it takes, she'll tell you. Somebody knocks, somebody stays. That's the whole thing. That's the whole story.